What if I told you that in the span of just a few hours today, the entire trajectory of the Ukraine war shifted in ways that nobody, not intelligence analysts, not diplomats, not military strategists, predicted or anticipated, not over weeks of careful diplomatic maneuvering behind closed doors, not through months of painstaking back-channel negotiations conducted in secret, but in hours, just hours. Hours that sent genuine shockwaves through European capitals, from Paris to Berlin to Warsaw. Hours that forced a wartime president to make the most consequential decision of his presidency. Hours that exposed deep fractures and fault lines in the Western alliance that many desperately hoped would stay hidden beneath the surface. What happened today wasn't just another development in a long, grinding war. It wasn't just another twist in an ongoing conflict. It was a fundamental collision between two completely different visions of how this conflict should end, what principles should guide that ending, and who gets to make those decisions. And caught directly in the middle of that collision is a nation that has spent 3 brutal, devastating years fighting for its very survival, losing thousands of soldiers and civilians, watching cities reduced to rubble. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what unfolded hour by hour, why it matters far more than you might initially think, and what it reveals about the genuinely dangerous new phase this war has entered. For weeks leading up to today, there had been signals floating through diplomatic circles, not official announcements through press offices, not formal diplomatic statements released to media, just signals, subtle indicators, quiet warnings that something genuinely unprecedented was brewing in Washington. President Trump has always been fundamentally transactional in his foreign policy approach. That's well established and documented. He sees international relations through the lens of deals, negotiations, leverage, and outcomes. But he's also been relatively predictable in that transactionalism. His moves have followed a certain identifiable logic, a recognizable rhythm that seasoned observers have learned to track, almost a detectable pattern that intelligence analysts and diplomatic professionals have become skilled at reading and anticipating. But what set off genuine alarm bells in Kiev, Brussels, London, and other key capitals this past week was that the pattern suddenly went completely silent. The usual indicators stopped appearing, the typical signals disappeared, and whenever the Trump administration goes quiet on Ukraine, when the normal communication patterns cease, experienced observers know exactly what that means. Something significant is about to get very loud, very public, very quickly. Intelligence analysts who spend their professional lives monitoring diplomatic backchannels, tracking communication flows, and watching for patterns know precisely what indicators to watch for when major policy shifts are brewing. They track the volume and frequency of communications between capitals. They notice when military aid shipments previously flowing on schedule experience unexplained delays or holdups. They pay very close attention when key diplomatic personnel, ambassadors, and special envoys with critical expertise are quietly recalled to Washington for urgent consultations. They take careful note when scheduled video calls between President Zelensky and senior U.S. officials, meetings that had been on the calendar for weeks, are suddenly canceled without clear public explanation or obvious reason. All of these things happened in recent days. Every single one of these warning indicators appeared. And then early this morning, everything that had been building beneath the surface exploded suddenly into public view. State Department sources detected what they carefully described as unusual diplomatic activity, including the sudden activation of back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow that hadn't been used in over 18 months. These aren't normal diplomatic channels. These aren't the kinds of lines you use for routine conversations or standard coordination. These are the channels that American presidents only activate when they need to signal something very specific, a major policy shift, a willingness to negotiate on difficult issues, or an ultimatum. Intelligence analysts monitoring these channels didn't initially know which category this fell into, or whether it somehow fell into all 3 categories simultaneously. But what they knew with absolute certainty was that the Trump administration was fundamentally changing its posture toward Ukraine. And when an American president shifts position on a major foreign policy issue without explanation, especially on something as consequential as Ukraine, the entire world pays very close attention. By mid-morning, the contours of Trump's proposal began leaking to journalists from multiple sources in different capitals, and what emerged was absolutely stunning, shocking even to seasoned diplomatic observers who thought they'd seen everything. According to sources speaking to multiple news outlets on condition of anonymity, President Trump proposed the following framework for ending the war in Ukraine. First, an immediate ceasefire along current lines of control, which would effectively freeze Russia's territorial gains in place, legitimizing 3 years of illegal invasion and occupation. Second, a binding commitment from Ukraine to abandon its NATO membership aspirations for at least 20 years, removing Ukraine's primary security guarantee. Third, internationally supervised referendums in Russian-occupied territories, which would almost certainly be manipulated to show support for Russian annexation. Fourth, a phased reduction of Western sanctions on Russia tied to vague compliance measures. And fifth, perhaps most controversially, a significant reduction in U.S. military aid to Ukraine, regardless of whether Russia actually accepts any of these terms. Let me be clear about what this represents. This wasn't a negotiating position designed to start conversations. This wasn't an opening bid in complex diplomatic bargaining. This was, in the assessment of multiple European officials speaking tonight, a capitulation demand dressed up as diplomacy. And critically, it came not from Moscow, but from Washington. America's closest European allies were blindsided. They weren't consulted. They weren't briefed in advance. They learned about it the same way the rest of us did, through media reports and frantic phone calls between capitals. The response issued by Ukraine tonight was extraordinary. It was not normal diplomatic protocol. It was not routine pushback. It was not symbolic resistance. It was urgent, forceful, and left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. Official after official, statement after statement described Trump's proposal as fundamentally unacceptable, a betrayal of shared democratic values, and perhaps most importantly, a reward for Russian aggression that would destabilize global security for decades to come. But here's what makes Ukraine's response even more remarkable. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for time to consider. They didn't signal willingness to negotiate around the edges. Within 3 hours of the proposal leaking, President Zelensky convened an emergency session of Ukraine's National Security Council. Within 4 hours, Ukraine's foreign ministry issued a formal, comprehensive rejection. Within 5 hours, Zelensky himself addressed the entire nation in a televised speech that left absolutely no room for ambiguity. These weren't the carefully measured, diplomatically worded statements we've grown accustomed to hearing from Ukrainian officials over the past 3 years. These were declarations of principle, statements that Ukraine only makes when it is genuinely prepared to stand completely alone if necessary. And that willingness to stand alone, even against enormous pressure from its most important ally, sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Because everyone watching understood what it meant. Ukraine was drawing a line, and they were prepared to defend that line regardless of consequences. Let me read you the key passage from Zelensky's statement tonight, because his words matter. We have not sacrificed so much, so many lives, so many cities, so many futures to accept terms dictated by those who have never felt a Russian bomb fall on their homes. Ukraine will decide Ukraine's future, not Moscow, not any other capital, Ukraine. That is not the language of a nation preparing to negotiate. That is not the tone of leaders looking for compromise. That is the language of a nation preparing to endure whatever comes next. And it represents a fundamental, dramatic break with the assumption held by many in Washington that Ukraine would ultimately accept whatever terms its patrons dictated, that they would eventually buckle under pressure and accept a bad deal rather than continue fighting. Today, Ukraine made absolutely clear that assumption was completely wrong. Ukraine didn't just reject the territorial concessions that would give Russia permanent control over occupied regions. They didn't just reject the NATO restrictions that would leave them permanently vulnerable to future Russian aggression. They didn't just reject the legitimization of forced referendums in occupied territories. They rejected it all, every single element, knowing full well what that rejection might cost them in terms of American support, military aid, and diplomatic backing. That takes courage, that takes conviction, and it reveals something crucial about Ukrainian resolve that Putin may have fundamentally miscalculated. And here's where this story becomes even more strategically significant. Intelligence analysts now believe, based on communications intercepts and pattern analysis, that Putin's latest demands and the massive, devastating airstrikes we've witnessed over the past 72 hours were specifically designed to test the cohesion of Western support after Trump's election victory. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would pressure Kyiv to accept unfavorable terms. He wanted to see if Trump would deliver what Russian missiles could not: Ukrainian capitulation. But instead, something remarkable happened. The exact opposite occurred. Ukraine didn't fold under the combined pressure of Russian bombs and American diplomatic proposals. They issued a rejection that was so swift, so coordinated, so unambiguous that even the Kremlin noticed. And you don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Kyiv did. Senior European diplomats speaking with journalists tonight under conditions of anonymity describe Putin's current strategy as textbook coercive diplomacy, a calculated attempt to force Ukraine into accepting terms before the battlefield situation could potentially shift in Ukraine's favor. Military pressure combined with diplomatic pressure, both designed to break Ukrainian will and create facts on the ground that become permanent, but Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to resist. Their rejection wasn't only immediate, it was coordinated across all levels of government, from Zelensky himself down through foreign ministry officials, defense officials, and parliamentary leaders. This was Ukraine speaking with one voice, and that voice said, no. Now, European response to all of this has been fascinating to watch unfold in real time. France, Germany, and Poland have all issued carefully worded but substantive statements tonight reaffirming their commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. These statements didn't directly criticize Trump's proposal, at least not in public, but they didn't need to. The message was clear. Europe stands with Ukraine regardless of what Washington proposes. Behind the scenes, according to diplomatic sources, European coordination has been intense and remarkably unified. Emergency calls between capitals, urgent consultations between foreign ministries, plans being developed for scenarios where American support might waver or disappear entirely. This is Europe preparing for the possibility that they might need to support Ukraine without substantial American backing, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. But here's what nobody expected, what has genuinely surprised observers across the political spectrum. Trump's proposal is facing massive pushback, not just from Europe and Ukraine, but from within the United States itself. Senator Lindsey Graham, hardly a critic of President Trump and usually one of his most loyal defenders, called the proposal deeply concerning and warned it could embolden aggressors worldwide. Former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, speaking on television tonight, said the proposal would fundamentally undermine American credibility and reward territorial conquest. And perhaps most significantly, a bipartisan group of senators released a joint statement this evening reaffirming congressional support for Ukraine regardless of executive branch policy decisions. This is not the political reaction Putin was counting on when he launched this latest pressure campaign. This is not the division within Western ranks he was hoping to skillfully exploit. This is not the isolation and abandonment of Ukraine he has been systematically working to achieve. And this is certainly not the capitulation he was demanding and expecting. What makes this moment so genuinely dangerous, so historically consequential for the future of European security, is that Putin's latest dramatic moves, including the devastating airstrikes and the public demands for territorial concessions, are happening at a time when he is facing absolutely enormous internal pressure within Russia from multiple competing constituencies. Kremlin hardliners, including influential figures in the military and security services, are loudly demanding a decisive military victory that they can present to the Russian people as justification for 3 years of war, enormous casualties, and economic hardship. These are not people who accept stalemate or frozen conflict. They want victory parades. They want conquered territory. They want something that looks like winning. Oligarchs who have lost literally billions of dollars in frozen assets, seized properties, and restricted business operations are desperately pushing for sanctions relief and renewed access to Western financial systems. These are Putin's key supporters, the people whose wealth and backing help keep him in power, and they're becoming increasingly impatient with the costs of continued conflict. conflict. Military commanders on the ground are constantly requesting more troops, more advanced weapons, more resources, more equipment to continue grinding operations that have proven far more difficult and costly than anyone in Moscow initially anticipated. The Russian military machine is being stretched thin, and commanders know it. And perhaps most significantly, ordinary Russians, hundreds of millions of citizens, increasingly feeling severe economic strain from Western sanctions, international isolation, and the redirection of national resources toward military operations, desperately want the war to end one way or another. They see rising prices, limited opportunities, restricted travel, and growing casualty lists from their communities. They're exhausted, frustrated, and wondering why their lives have gotten so much harder. Public opinion in Russia, while carefully controlled by state media, is not irrelevant to Putin's calculations. Putin is desperately trying to balance all of these competing, contradictory demands while simultaneously managing significant battlefield setbacks that have damaged his credibility both internationally and domestically. And when political leaders in that kind of pressured position make sudden dramatic moves, experienced analysts know they're typically not acting from strength. They're acting from pressure. They're acting from vulnerability. They're acting from desperation. The massive airstrikes we witnessed this week weren't signs of Russian confidence or overwhelming power. They were signs of Russian desperation, a frantic attempt to force a resolution before the ground shifts even further against Moscow's interests. And Trump's proposal, whether intentionally coordinated with Putin or not, played directly into that desperate Russian strategy. It signaled to Moscow that Washington might be willing to deliver diplomatically what Russian missiles and troops could not achieve militarily: Ukrainian capitulation and acceptance of permanent territorial losses. But today, Ukraine took that option completely off the table. They slammed the door shut. They made clear that no amount of pressure, whether from Russian bombs or American proposals, would force them to accept terms they consider unacceptable. And in doing so, they may have fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of this war. The formal response from the State Department, now being distributed to all U.S. embassies worldwide, was very carefully worded, but its message was unmistakable to anyone who knows how to read diplomatic language. Officials acknowledged that the United States supports a negotiated end to the conflict, which is standard boilerplate language, but they also explicitly stated that any resolution must be fully consistent with Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is diplomatic code for "we hear the criticism, we understand we miscalculated badly, and we're trying to walk this back without admitting we made a mistake." You don't usually hear that kind of diplomatic hedging and backpedaling from an administration that just made a major policy announcement unless something has gone seriously wrong. And tonight, something has indeed gone seriously wrong for the White House. The proposal that was supposed to demonstrate bold American leadership has instead demonstrated American division and confusion. The offer that was supposed to pressure Ukraine into accepting reality has instead unified Ukraine's international supporters. And the diplomatic initiative that was supposed to end the war has instead clarified just how fundamentally far apart all the parties remain. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people tonight in a somber but determined televised speech that's already being analyzed in capitals worldwide. He said something that will be quoted for years to come. "We did not start this war. We did not invite this suffering, but we will decide how it ends." He continued, "No nation, no matter how powerful, has the right to trade away the territory of another nation. That is not diplomacy. That is imperialism with better marketing." Those words will resonate far beyond Ukraine's borders. They speak to fundamental principles about sovereignty, self-determination, and the international order that has existed since World War II. What we're watching right now is fundamentally a test of resolve on multiple levels simultaneously. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can be pressured into accepting permanent territorial losses. Ukraine wants to demonstrate that its sovereignty is absolutely not negotiable under any circumstances. European allies want to prevent the complete collapse of the security architecture they've carefully built and maintained since World War II. And the United States, now visibly divided between an administration seeking quick transactional deals and a Congress still committed to supporting Ukrainian resistance, wants to prevent a catastrophic foreign policy failure that would embolden adversaries worldwide. These competing objectives don't easily align, and how they're reconciled or not reconciled in the coming weeks will shape not just Ukraine's future, but the fundamental future of international order itself. Tonight, we're hearing from multiple intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements with significantly heightened attention and concern. They report that Russian forces are repositioning in ways that strongly suggest preparation for major offensive operations. They say communications intercepts clearly indicate Kremlin frustration with Ukraine's swift, comprehensive rejection. And they assess that Putin's decision to dramatically escalate airstrikes is almost certainly part of a broader coercion strategy specifically intended to break Ukrainian morale before remaining diplomatic options completely close. But here's what's becoming increasingly clear. Ukraine is not breaking. In fact, Ukraine is consolidating. Their response today, swift and coordinated and absolutely unequivocal, sent a powerful message to Moscow that pressure tactics, no matter how intense, will not produce capitulation. And it sent an equally powerful message to Washington that alliance does not mean subservience, that partnership does not mean accepting dictation. European officials speaking tonight, carefully choosing their words, described Ukraine's stance as principled and necessary. That's diplomatic language for, we completely agree with Kyiv, even if we can't say it directly or publicly. And that quiet European alignment with Ukraine against the Trump proposal may prove far more important than any single statement or any individual proposal. As the night continues, we expect many more details to emerge about what exactly Trump hoped to achieve with this proposal. Was it a genuine attempt at peacemaking, however misguided? Was it a calculated pressure tactic designed to force Zelensky to the negotiating table? Was it a fundamental miscalculation that completely underestimated Ukrainian resolve and overestimated American leverage? We genuinely don't yet know. But what we absolutely do know is that Ukraine's response was timely and consequential. It prevented the narrative from shifting toward inevitable compromise. It reinforced European commitment at an absolutely crucial moment, and it reminded the entire world that Ukraine is not merely a passive object of great power politics. It is an active agent, a nation making its own choices, determining its own future. What happens next will depend almost entirely on what Moscow does in the next several days. If Putin scales back attacks and returns to genuine diplomatic engagement, this moment will be remembered as a potential turning point toward negotiation. If he escalates even further, Ukraine and its allies have already demonstrated today that they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are not intimidated by Russian military pressure. They have shown they are not swayed by American diplomatic pressure. They are ready to endure whatever comes next. And in this particular war, endurance has proven to be perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. And tonight, for the first time in several weeks, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely recalculating its entire approach and strategy. Russian state media, usually bombastic and triumphalist and overflowing with confidence about inevitable victory, has been notably remarkably restrained in its coverage of today's dramatic events. The usual aggressive rhetoric, the standard threats, the typical triumphalism, is largely conspicuously absent. And when Moscow suddenly goes quiet like this, when the propaganda machine shifts gears so dramatically, experienced Kremlin watchers who've studied Russian behavior for years know exactly what it means. They are thinking hard. They are seriously reassessing their options and assumptions. They are choosing their next move very, very carefully, weighing consequences and calculating probabilities. Because tonight, Putin learned something crucial that he perhaps should have learned much earlier in this 3-year conflict, something that might have changed his entire approach if he'd understood it from the beginning. Ukraine will not be bullied into submission through military pressure alone. Bombing cities, devastating though it is, does not produce capitulation from a determined population. It produces defiance. It strengthens resolve rather than breaking it. Pressure and threats do not weaken Ukrainian will to resist. If anything, they strengthen it, harden it, make it more determined. And nations genuinely fighting for their survival, for their very existence as independent states, do not make strategic decisions based on the convenience or preferences of other powers, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how influential those other powers might be. Sovereignty means something. Independence means something. The right to choose your own future means something. And tonight, Ukraine demonstrated that these principles are worth defending at enormous cost. This story is very, very far from over. We're not at an ending point. We're possibly at a beginning of a new, even more dangerous phase. The coming days will inevitably bring new challenges from multiple directions, new forms of pressure from various actors, new tests of will and resolve from all sides involved in this conflict, military challenges, diplomatic challenges, economic challenges, political challenges. They're all coming, and everyone involved knows it. But tonight, right now, one thing is absolutely clear to anyone paying close attention. Ukraine remains unbowed, unbroken, and defiant despite everything that has been thrown at them over 3 years. Despite hundreds of thousands of casualties, despite cities reduced to rubble, despite millions of refugees, despite economic devastation, they remain standing, fighting, refusing to accept defeat or submission. The Western alliance, though severely strained and tested in ways nobody anticipated when this war began, has not broken completely. The bonds between democratic nations, while frayed, still hold. The commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty, while questioned by some, remains strong among many, and the dream of a quick, easy diplomatic resolution that sacrifices Ukrainian sovereignty for the convenience of Western powers, that trades away Ukrainian territory to make problems disappear, remains exactly what it always was, a dangerous fantasy completely disconnected from the reality on the ground. This is ultimately a war that will be decided not by diplomatic proposals drafted in comfortable offices far from the fighting. It will be decided by endurance, by the ability to keep going when everything seems impossible. It will be decided by courage, by the willingness to keep fighting when the costs are almost unbearable. It will be decided by resolve, by the determination to defend what you believe in regardless of pressure. And it will be decided by the fundamental willingness to defend core principles, sovereignty, independence, and self-determination, even when doing so is enormously costly in lives, treasure, and suffering. And tonight, in its swift, comprehensive, unequivocal rejection of Trump's proposal, Ukraine showed the entire world, everyone watching from Washington to Moscow to Beijing, that it possesses all of these qualities in abundance: the endurance to keep fighting, the courage to stand alone if necessary, the resolve to reject unacceptable terms, and the willingness to defend principles at enormous cost. The next phase of this historic struggle, this defining conflict of our time, is just beginning. The choices made in the coming days and weeks will echo through history, and Ukraine has made its choice absolutely clear.